Afternoon. This is Dyke Hendrickson, and you're here with me and Life Along the Merrimack. And in this program, it's a weekly program, we talk about the history and health of the Merrimack River. As you might know, in the past few years, the river has been getting dirtier, not cleaner. And there's a lot of legislative moves around that, but I think anyone who lives up here is interested in the river. And so that's one of the themes in the air. That's one reason why this program started a year ago. And this is a 51st segment. Today, I'm going to talk about the Merrimack River and kind of talk about the history of the river. I'm writing a book on it, for one thing. It's called Merrimack, the Resilient River. And among the elements that I'm looking at is the history of it all. And I'm going to explain why it's such a historic river. Soon I'll have a PowerPoint presentation with colorful images about the waterway and its history, but these things take time. Also, starting June 9th, I'm going to have a seminar, two-part seminar at the Newburyport Adult Education Program, where I'm going to talk about the history of the waterfront and then the history of the river. But right now, I'm going to talk a little about why the river is historic. And there are about 4 or 5 reasons we think about the Merrimack River in terms of history. One is that is the birthplace of the Coast Guard. Newburyport in the 18th century was really the colony's leading shipbuilder. That seems strange because Boston's so large now, Portsmouth and Portland. But at the time, say 1750 to 1800, Newburyport was as large as Boston and was a very prosperous community. The leaders were among the top in the colonies, and this was a community that led the colonies a number of ships built each year. We had enormous amount of foreign trade to India, to China, to Russia. So this was a place that built a lot of vessels. It had a lot of important people. One of the reasons Newburyport could build vessels because of the river. Timber could be shipped down from New Hampshire and other parts of New England, other parts of Massachusetts. And that isn't, most communities did build ships, but they didn't have such good access to timber as we do. So the river provided transportation for the timber to get here. Newburyport people were national leaders. And so when George Washington and Alexander Hamilton got together in 1789, they were saying, well, the revolution is over, but we've got no money in the till. And what we'd like to do is build some ships called revenue cutters so they can go out into the New England's harbors and Virginia's harbors. Number one, stop the smuggling because a lot of goods were coming in without paying tariffs. And the other thing was just to board the ships that did come along to make sure that their cargoes were checked and that they're actually paying what they should be paying. This was an enormous source of revenue for the new country. And so for that reason, 10 of these revenue cutters were built. And the first one was built right here in Newburyport and a shipyard behind the Custom House Maritime Museum. It was called the Massachusetts. It was 60 feet long. It had a crew of 10, 4 officers, 4 crew, and a couple cabin boys. It could be armed, and it's very fast. And it was also the people who ran it, John Foster Wilson, was the first captain. They were very knowledgeable because they had come through the Revolutionary War. They have done a lot of ship work with ships. And so they knew where to look for the smugglers. And these revenue cutters were very successful. So Newburyport, because it did create the Massachusetts, the first revenue cutter, was named the birthplace of the Coast Guard. The Revenue Service merged with the Life-Saving Service in 1915. That was the first time the word Coast Guard was mentioned. And then the two merged with the Lighthouse Service in 1939 to create the Coast Guard as we know. But way back in 1790, the Massachusetts was built. It was launched in 1791, and thus the start of the Coast Guard is attributed right here in Newburyport. So the river was important for that. Built here, went through that narrow opening that we know so well at Plum Island, and it got into the world. It, was quite successful, and more things happened after that. We built more ships, and Newburyport was well known as a result of that. Another reason why the Merrimack River is historic is because it is the birthplace of the Industrial Revolution. Mills were built along the Merrimack River starting in the 1820s. There had been mills in Waltham and Boston, but the Merrimack River up near Lowell and Lawrence had waterfalls, some as high as 30 feet high, which were very good in capturing the energy of the river, and they can turn turbines and create energy in mills. And in about 1820, 2 centuries ago, Lowell and Lawrence became, and the men who ran them became kind of the Silicon Valley of this country, 1820. And so first small mills were built, and then larger ones. And as they got the knack of how to build a mill, how to recruit people to work there, how to harness this hydro power, more mills became prevalent here. And so in late 1820s, there were 6 to 8 large mills. And then 10 or 20 years later, Lawrence was created to be a mill town. They built the mills first. They knew what they were doing. And so in 1848, Lawrence became a regular community. So Lowell and Lawrence, starting in the 1820s and going through the late 1840s, were building mills, which were among the largest in the country, and creating an enormous amount of cotton cloth, shoes, and other elements that you needed large factories for. Now, it might be said also that one of the downsides of creating these great mills was that all the pollution went into the Merrimack River. At that time, there was very little thought about the value of the river and the value of wildlife, although Thoreau was an early objector. He went by in like 1839 when he wrote his book, A Week Along the Concord and Merrimack River. This is 1839. It was published in 1849. He said, this is really bad. I mean, the fish are just going to disappear. There's terrible pollution in the river. And maybe if the fish and the wildlife can outlive the men in the mills that are built along the river, this will be a beautiful river again. But way back in 1839, he noticed, as others did, that the mills were polluting the river. Now, I say that because we deal with pollution today. It's much better, and we'll get into that. But pollution started when the mills arrived. Another factor that's interesting about the arrival of the mills in 1820 to say 1860, which that was Lowell, Lawrence, Manchester, New Hampshire, is the workers. Initially, they were factory girls, they were called. They were young women who came from the farms. They built dorms for them. They had dorm mothers, I think, something that used to exist in college, but I doubt exists anymore. But they had a lot of girls who would work in the mills for 3 or 4 years. They would, in a way, it was a liberation of sorts because the girls did not have much of an opportunity on the farms. Their parents didn't leave them the farms. The brothers got those. The girls did a great deal of work on the farms in New Hampshire and Massachusetts, but they did not get paid for it. So this was a chance, probably quite exciting, and there have been books about this, about the girls being on their own. They had roommates, they had a dorm, they had their own cash. That was very unusual, say, in the mid-19th century for a young girl to be making cash. Now, they sent much of the money home, but still, it was a moment. And the factory girls worked hard, but even, one of the first, it wasn't a strike, it was called a labor concern, wasn't way back in 1835. And some of them said, geez, we're working 12 hours a day, 6 days a week. We're not making much money. The health conditions are not very good. And so, they would have what they call a factory girls walkout. Now, it wasn't violent, of course, but this isn't really acknowledged. We'll get to the Bread and Roses strike of 1912 in a moment. But to think of these farm girls, now factory girls, saying, look, this isn't working for us. You're not being fair. We're going to take a day off or something like that. So these girls were among the first labor organizers. That happened on the Merrimack River. That is not generally known, but it's an interesting situation. So in 1848, we were saying Lawrence was built. It was built, the mills were planned first, and then the dorms and the stores. And they wanted everybody to be close by. And believe it or not, the factory owners wanted the mill workers to be happy, because in England, they had seen were indentured servants, and mills were terrible places to work. There was a lot of disease. And so some of the factory owners were progressive in their own way. And they said, look, let's do it right. We'll build them dorms. They'll have stores. They'll have some hours off. And we'll just try to make it as good as we can for these people. So they did. It kind of got away from them. But this was an opportunity for girls to make money and be instrumental to the making of the textile industry. Now, moving up until about 1890, we have something that's not very well known, but it's extremely important. It was clean water in Lawrence. The factory owners and powers that be were not very interested in the workers. The factory owners usually had their own wells. I'm talking about well water to drink, to cook with at home. They had their own wells. They could dig their own wells. But the factory workers who lived near the river, in most cases, did not have their own mills. They had to drink the water from the river. And they had a cleaning process. It was kind of involved a solar process and natural filtering, but it wasn't very good. And so in 1890, there was an outbreak of typhoid fever in Lawrence, mostly along the waterfront or, in the tenement areas where the people got their water from the river. Thinking today, we would say, gosh, who would drink that water if there wasn't an important scientific process? But there wasn't. They drank the water and typhoid fever broke out. A number of young people died. So the state, this is about 1892, got together a commission which said, we have to study the water along the Merrimack River. We have to make it better. And they recruited several luminaries from MIT right down the road, or down the path at that time. And so they came up, they studied the river in a very, intricate way. And they found new ways that they felt they could make better drinking water. And so they started this, and it was launched in about 1892 or 1893. And the typhoid and, the diphtheria and some of these diseases passed away after several years. And so they attributed this new system of cleaning water to what the MIT folks had done. And this system not only cleaned the water of the Merrimack River, but it was able to be replicated in other communities, not just along the Merrimack, but around the country. And as I say, this is not a well-known feature of the Merrimack River. I haven't read much about it at all, but it will be in my book. But it is interesting that among the first that the Merrimack is known for is that the ability, not the ability, but the capability that there was clean water as a result of MIT scientists, as a result of the state officials making it so. So that is a good story. Another interesting aspect of the Merrimack River was the more organized labor confrontations. The Merrimack and the Merrimack Valley, all these mills in Lowell, Lawrence, Haverhill, Newburyport, and of course up the river in Concord, in Nashua, New Hampshire, they drew a great number of immigrants because they ran out of farm girls, the mill girls. Um, Maybe they got tired of these bad conditions. But as I think we all know, in the late 19th century, many immigrants came to the Merrimack Valley to work in the mills, Italians and Greeks, Jews from Europe, many French Canadians. I've written 2 books about the French Canadians. It was a good deal for them. They could come here in the winter, make some cash, go back in the summer, help on the family farm in Quebec. And it was called Streets Paved with Gold. Now, a lot of immigrants wouldn't think that Lawrence or Lowell, which there was much gold paving going on and the roadways. But for the French, it was very useful because they could make money in the winter and go back in the summer. In fact, there was one anecdote from one of my books called Quiet Presence, Stories of Franco-Americans in New England. There were 12 young people from Sanford, Maine, who they weren't from Sanford, they were from Quebec. They all worked in a mill in Sanford and then next year in Lawrence. And of the 12 who worked there, they were 18 to 22, say, only one of them settled in the Merrimack Valley. All 11 of them went back, boys and girls. And so, for some people, the French particularly, it was very convenient. For others, though, they couldn't go back to Europe where they came from. It was too expensive. It was, just getting here was enormous. So, so their lives were on the line. And in 1914, there was accumulation of unhappiness that occurred in Lawrence. It was in many communities, but Lawrence was well known. It was called the Bread and Roses strike. They wanted shorter hours going down from, say, 11 to 9. They wanted to have a little more time off. They wanted better conditions, and they didn't want pay cuts. Occasionally the mill owners would be a little full of themselves and say, well, we had a bad year, your pay is going to be cut by, 5% or 10%. So if you're in a small community and there are no other jobs, you have to work there. And the thought of, not just getting a raise, but getting a cut in pay, or you're going to get the same pay, but you're going to have to work longer hours, this obviously is not appealing. So many of the different ethnic groups got together. There must have been 12 or 14. And so that, they began planning a strike, and then they did strike in 1914. And it was a very difficult, it was winter, I remember that. The state police came in on horses, and there were scores of them, if not hundreds. The state really sided with the mill owners on this one. And I remember the photos, maybe you've seen them themselves, the police on their horses. They had these great coats because it was so cold. The people were freezing. They had trouble getting food. There was a national labor movement at the time, but it wasn't like today. Well, I wouldn't even say today because there isn't much of a labor movement today, but they didn't get too much outside help. It was remembered, however, that many mill families sent their kids out of town into the country if they could. The Canadians, French Canadians, probably sent their kids back to Quebec, which they had family in. And many of the children were sent to farms or different communities. There was a lot of sympathy for the strike around the country. And there were families not associated with these strikers who would take children in. It's kind of reminds one of World War II in London during the Blitz when the Germans were bombing London. Many of the youngsters were sent out of town to the countryside, to an aunt, to a grandparents. Different homes were set up in the countryside to get out of the way of the bombing. This was similar to the Bread and Roses strike. So this was eventually, it was a small victory, I think, for the strikers. It was not a long-range victory whatsoever. Things still remained grim, and but it is remembered that they worked hard, even though they didn't speak their own language. a lot of these mill workers really stuck together, got some national support, were able to hold out, get small short-term gains, but not long-term gains. And then not long after that, the immigration policy began changing in the 1915 to 1920. In the 20s, a lot of immigrants had come to the Merrimack Valley. A lot of immigrants had come to many East and West Coast cities. And you might recall that immigration became a bad word, say in the 1910s and 1920s. And so for immigration kind of slowed down, and that might be the way it is today, that there's complexity in the air, and national leaders just wanted to put a slowdown on immigration because they felt immigration was adding to the challenges with labor in this country. Another interesting aspect of the Merrimack River is the fact that it took so long for national legislators to do anything about the pollution. Now, there wasn't a national environmental clean water legislation in this country until about 1948. I mean, that's late in the game. It's like more than almost 2 centuries after all this pollution started. And, sometimes the pollution was so bad that, the water would look orange or look green, because that's the kind of dye that was being used in the larger plants that day. And so there was illness, as we said, but the first legislation was not until 1948. It was kind of tepid, didn't go anywhere, but that was the start of a consciousness, what might be called the environmental movement. And it wasn't just the Merrimack River, of course, rivers all over the country. I think the Cuyahoga River in the 70s famously in Cleveland, caught on fire, but still it was so early in the game, there was not a consciousness. And the captains of industry just viewed the rivers, like the Merrimack River, as their property. They put anything they wanted into it. So 48 was the first of the weak legislation federally, and the Clean Water Act was passed in 1972. Ed Muskie, Senator Muskie from Maine, who you might remember, made a good bid for president in those days. To me, the most memorable thing he did is not run for president or be accused of crying in Manchester, New Hampshire. He said there were snowflakes on his cheeks, and I'm going with that one. But he was not capable of getting the nomination for president, but he did engineer the Clean Water Act of 1972. This was an enormous thing for the Merrimack River, for the rivers, the Kennebec River, the Presumscot up in Maine, rivers, the Hudson River, all the many rivers. And what the Clean Water Act did, well, first of all, it was a huge amount of money. But secondly, it mandated sewage treatment plants. Like, you have to do this. And I was working in Maine in the early 70s, a cub reporter. I started at 6, as you can tell. I must have been young. But the timber companies up and paper mills up in Maine were furious at Muskie. I mean, the paper mills were ruining the Maine rivers, just as textiles were ruining the Merrimack River. But he was a brave guy, and he grew up in Rumford, Maine, which is a mill town, and maybe that's why he was so motivated. You could smell it. It was hard to get, you wouldn't think about drinking the water. But he was able to get the Clean Water Act passed in 1972. Now, Richard Nixon, the president, vetoed the Clean Water Act, but it was passed over a veto. Now, it's of course, the House and the Senate were both Democratic, so they could do that. But it is a little difficult to think about things passing over a Republican veto today. Of course, the Senate's Republicans, and you've got that. But anyway, I just remember Muskie as being a strong, really persistent legislator to get. He had to convince all sorts of people in the Senate and then in the House. And today it seems, well, it doesn't seem strange because there are people who are walking backwards on water pollution in this country. But I do remember his good bravery and his good persistence in getting the Clean Water Act passed. So that started in 1972, and the Merrimack was one of those communities that definitely benefited. And one of the major things was creating the sewage treatment plants, as we just said. But the engineering in those days involved putting the rainwater, the stormwater, in the same pipes as the sewage. So a lot of rainwater and heavy rains would go into the sewage treatment plants. They would become overcome. There was too much there, and they would have a discharge. So they discharged the rainwater, but as part of, by definition, they also discharge the sewage. And so that is what we're having today. We're having, because of climate change, scientists say we have more rainfalls in the spring and early summer that put pressure on the sewage treatment plants. And as a result, they discharge. And that's why from time to time we get sewage here in the Merrimack River. Now, I remember I was with Mayor Donna Holliday, the Newburyport mayor, half dozen years ago. I was the waterfront reporter for the Daily News at the time. And where it was after a terrible 3-day storm and the river was brown. It was. I mean, you look across and you say, like, what is going on? And that's what she basically said. Like, Newburyport, Salisbury, and Amesbury had all improved their sewage treatment plants so the rainwater wouldn't go in there. But a lot of communities didn't. Manchester is a huge, Lowell and Lawrence. And so that's where we are right now. And we have many legislators meeting regularly to try to see if we can get some more federal money. Now, one of the problems with the Clean Water Act of 1972 was it provided grants for the communities, and that's good. But when President Reagan was in office, and in 1987, he had that amended, so the communities would only get loans. Obviously, you have to pay a loan back at an interest rate. So it went from being a really terrific program where communities got grants to a loan program. And frequently Manchester and Lowell and Lawrence, they say, hey, look, we don't have the money. I mean, they want to do well, but it's a political nut that's very hard to crack. And so I know that that some of the things even today come out of the Merrimack River are a bit shocking. They're still pulling cars out of the river. They're getting hypodermic needles out of the river. That said, we have a good crew working on it. Congresswoman Lori Trahan from Lowell has filed a bill to get some federal money for the Merrimack. She calls herself the sewage lady. She's in her first term, and I've heard her speak, and she said, in Washington, I'm known as a sewage lady. I never thought that would be my bent in life or my handle in life, but here I am. And then State Senator Diana DiZoglio, who represents the North Shore. She's from Methuen. She's been working hard as well. So we're going to see what happens. But these are just a couple of the highlights that I remember for the Merrimack River. As I say, I'm going to have a book out on it this time next year, Merrimack, the Resilient River. And some of these historical facts will be in. But this is life along the Merrimack. I enjoy being here. We're doing it from Zoom, of course. I live in Newburyport, and that's where this is coming from. But we'll meet up again, and I'll talk about, I'm having a 2-part seminar for Newburyport Adult Education, June 12th and June 19th. That'll be on Zoom, and I'll talk about that next week. But thank you very much for looking in. I enjoyed, being here once again, and I'm hoping that we can continue to talk about the history of the river and the health of the river and a lot of things involved here on the North Shore. So thank you very much for being part of this. And I'm going to move along, and we'll meet here next week. We'll talk about my seminars coming up on Zoom and we'll keep talking about the Merrimack River. Thank you very much.